the time on my first word. Anthony and I are proud to affirm the resolution that U.S. states should implement year-round schooling for K through 12 education. This round will be a fact round. The definitions are as provided. Year-round schooling means school scheduling in which a single summer break is swapped out for a series of shorter breaks throughout the year. This is a valid education. This is a valid definition because it provides the educational value and at the same time makes sure that students aren't overworked. Our first contention is summer learning loss. Again, our first contention is summer learning loss. One study using data from over 500,000 students in grades 2 through 9 found that students on average lost between 25 to 30% of their school year learning over the summer. Additionally, Black and Latino students tended to lose more over the summer compared to white students due to less access to things like summer programs. This is according to the Brookings Institute. What we can see is that without the summer break, they won't have this opportunity of losing a lot of the knowledge and the education that they've had in the past. And this is an overall big impact because it allows us to understand that we're not allowing students to lose up to 25 to 30% of their school year learning. We can also see that according to NWEA, it is often cited that students lose on average 2 to 3 months of reading skills during that same summer. And so what we're seeing is that over time, because there is a huge gap in the amount of school and programs that students are able to become a part in, a lot of these students are losing that knowledge and education, which has its few impacts. The first impact is that school isn't serving its purpose. School obviously is to provide education to students, but when we lose that education and they totally forget about it in the summer, it isn't doing its purpose and it isn't serving the things it should be serving. The second impact is that children are left behind every year. What we have to see is also the second clause of that Brookings Institute part. It talked about Black and Latino students who tended to lose more knowledge over the summer compared to white students. People and children being left behind in the racial and low-income communities is a big problem because it separates white students from other minority students. These problems and nuances are something that need to be addressed and can not only be solved, but not furthered when we have summer learning loss. Also, we can look at low-income students being disadvantaged. We see how oftentimes students aren't able to engage in summer programs, which at the same time means that they aren't able to build upon, understand, or even remember and recall, review a lot of the knowledge that they were able to get. The last impact is that time is lost as teachers have to review. We know that there's a teacher shortage currently and that a lot of teachers are dealing with the stress of having to teach a lot of students. What's happening is that when they enter the next year, they have to spend a lot of time reviewing with these students. Not only is time is lost, but teachers, given the fact that they've already been working and preparing their course lessons over the summer, will be burnt out and there simply isn't enough of them. Our second contention is about higher education. According to the Hitchings report, the numbers reveal a glaring gap in the nation's education system. A high school diploma, no matter how recently earned, doesn't guarantee that students are prepared for college courses. Here's the link. What's happening when we have a summer break is that a lot of times students don't remember or recall certain concepts and certain ideas. We saw that with the previous example of 25 to 30%. The link here is that what happens in higher education is that when students enter college and such, they are not prepared for taking that coursework because they simply haven't reviewed it enough and they forgot a lot about what happened. According to PBS NewsHour, most schools place students in what are called remedial courses in math or English before they can move on to full load college level credit bearing courses, a process that is a financial drain not only on the students, but also on colleges and taxpayers, costing up to an estimated $7 billion a year. What's happening is that students aren't prepared, so they're resorting to remedial courses and classes, which cost a lot of money in tuition for the students, but also for the schools and taxpayers themselves. We have to make sure that students are prepared when they go into college, especially when their whole purpose is to go into the workforce. This has a few impacts. The first impact is that they're less prepared for higher education, which ultimately leads to higher dropout rates. Higher dropout rates has been something that has been on the rise. We're not saying that the only reason is because they're ill prepared, but a vast majority of them, since they cannot deal with the stress or they aren't sure what to do, they oftentimes drop out. The second impact is that students will be more stressed, since they have to learn a lot more in a certain amount of time, and because they forgot about what happened in the past, they'll be more stressed, which means that they're ill prepared, which ultimately leads to anxiety and school-related stress, both of which have been linked to growing rates of depression and anxiety. So making sure that students aren't faced with the medical repercussions of the school's education system is also important when looking at the context and making sure that they're providing for the people. The last contention is social impacts. Our subpoint A is childcare. The Center for American Progress in 2019 surveyed 1,000 families, and 57% of them reported that a lack of summer childcare meant that at least one parent had to make a job change, quitting or taking reduced hours that caused a reduction in their income. What's happening is that when parents want to make sure that they can support for their children and they aren't able to do that because of work, they have to either lay off or change drastically the amount of hours they serve. Childcare should not be a problem. Why? Because the education system also promises things like daycare, where they hope to hold these students whenever or for a certain amount of time to make sure that they're in a safe place while their parents are working and providing for their family. Also, schools offer childcare, which is like daycare, and childcare is more accessible to parents when it's only needed in short intervals, not the entire summer. Nannies can be replaced by friends and neighbors, or it can be paid off on a one-by-one basis. This means a few impacts. First, parents are temporarily pushed out of the job market, which results in future income losses. The second impact is that it harms the learning outcomes of their kids in the long run. Having more income is directly linked to performing better in school. So if we want to provide for the educational value of these students, we make sure that these breaks are shorter. That way, parents don't have to take off, they'll have more money and can provide for the educational needs of their students. Our subpoint B is social services. In an era where schools are often hubs for healthcare and other services, year-round schools have the added perk of allowing access to such services to continue throughout the calendar year. Our first impact is that more than 30 million kids who depend on US schools rely on them for free or reduced meal plans. These are important because it provides a certain amount of money towards these students so that they can eat. Remove that and put that 3 months in the summer, oftentimes they don't have enough money. Also, mental health services are a big part of it. And the last impact is about how schools are becoming vaccine centers and a trend that can continue even post COVID-19 by providing for students. And so, for all of these reasons, Anthony and I are proud to affirm. Thank you.
Before I begin my speech, can everyone hear me okay? All right, there have been some internet issues, so if I cut out, we can just stop time and refresh. But as a brief off-time roadmap, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Julian Ward, representing Sequoia High School. I'm the first negative speaker in today's debate. I'll essentially be going over the negation case in today's debate, going over our reasons and disadvantages to the resolution, and then I'll move on over to the affirmative case. So with all of that said, is everyone ready?
Really quickly, sorry. I think my fellow judge asked to put the speaker order in chat. So before you start your speech, could like both teams go ahead and do that?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So overall, is everyone ready? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. So again, my time will begin on my first word. Judges, I am proud to negate the resolution in today's debate. U.S. states should not implement year-round schooling for K-12 education. My first disadvantage in this round is about educational opportunities and opportunities to have a prosperous life in general. Let's look at the status quo. By its very nature, summer vacation is a vacation from school. It's an extended period of time for students to focus on other projects. On the high school level, for instance, students can utilize summer vacation to get extended internship opportunities, volunteer work, and the chance to take a college class that they are passionate about that they otherwise would not be able to because of dealing with so much other work during the school year ordinarily. For elementary and middle schoolers, summer vacation gives them opportunities to go to summer camps, potentially go on vacation and do other projects that don't necessarily pertain to school. And overall, everyone ultimately has the opportunity to schedule a trip because of the larger summer break. They're better able to schedule, which means they can visit a new place or see new relatives. These are all things that are inherent in the status quo, but how does the affirmative plan impact all this? What is the affirmative plan doing? Well, in the affirmative world, students attending public schools, and that's an important distinction because we're talking about states and their actions. This doesn't necessarily pertain to private schools. For these students attending public schools, they won't have nearly the same ability and to have opportunities to do things other than schools as they would in the status quo. Well, what's the impact of this? Well, younger students will lose out on many experiences that overall boost and benefit their development in adolescence, and older students will lose the time to learn necessary new skills, which, and I'll address this when I go over their case, could be beneficial for college and just beneficial for their life in general. So we can see that whichever age group you look at, not having a summer break, a time to de-stress from school, a time to relax, and a time to do other things, because while school is obviously important and neither team refutes this, there is more to life other than deadlines every week and barely even an extended break throughout the whole year. By giving students the opportunity to do other things, it gives them more flexibility and it helps them develop from an early age all the way through high school. So what are the overall impacts of this is that the mental health of people will decrease because, again, they don't have the opportunity to de-stress, and I'll address this more on the second contention, but also they just have less time to be carefree. And especially in early stages of adolescence, this is extremely important in development. And this is something that the opposing team have simply not fully considered. So, and then of course on the higher level, they lose out on necessary skills. I want to address the second disadvantage to this resolution, which is about transition costs. Well, we can see that in the status quo, just due to school and deadlines, that's always around the corner for around 3/4 of the year. But in summer break, there is a gradual transition away from school and then eventually back into school. School is very stressful. Again, there are constant deadlines. There are constantly things to do, especially in high school. And we can see that the issues of maintaining this idea of deadlines constantly throughout the entire year, 365 days with shorter breaks placed throughout, there is an MIT meta-analysis of several credible and expansive studies with over 50,000 students in both California and North Carolina that focused on the benefits and drawbacks of year-round schooling. And they found conclusively that reductions in learning rates due to constantly starting and stopping school nullify or even outweigh the benefits of less learning loss over the summer. This will be a response that I'll also articulate when I address over their case, but this is very important because learning loss is an issue, and I'll address that more, but we can see that on a net, the actual rate of learning declines more in the affirmative vision than in the negation world. So again, what are the links? Learning either stays roughly the same or worsens in the affirmative world. At least that's what the data suggests, and that's what we can logically conclude due to the higher stress and the issues with transitions. So again, similarly, the overall quality of learning is worse, which means they will be less able to get a higher education and, of course, increased rates of depression and anxiety. Now, on this final disadvantage, which is about school segregation, we can see that right now in the status quo, the majority of students, families, and teachers all unanimously, or not unanimously like for the specific group, but each of these groups, the majority of people want a summer break. Teachers want a summer break, students want a summer break, families want a summer break so that they can take their students to a vacation. Now, the affirmative, again, they're only impacting public schools. So what is effectively going to happen when there is a wealthy family that can choose between a public school or a private school when they really want a summer break? They're going to choose the private school, which means that funding is diverted directly away from public schools, which means that there will be massive educational disadvantages to the people that are disproportionately impoverished or minorities in these public schools because wealthier students will just be leaving to go to private schools because they have the ability to do so. Now, with all of that out of the way, I'd like to address the affirmative case. They first define this as a fact round, which we disagree with. Because the resolution has the word should in it, it implies that this is a policy round, which means that the affirmative team has the obligation to propose a plan text. However, it's pretty simple. We can just assume that they'll follow the resolution and that states will do this. So it doesn't really change the dynamic too much. But let's jump into their first advantage, which is about the losses caused by summer learning. Now, first of all, this learning loss isn't actually as bad as it seems because it's not as if they're losing out on knowledge from school and just not replacing it with anything. The reason why is because they're learning things over summer that might not necessarily be school related. It's not as if they're all just devolving. It's just that they're changing in what they're interacting with, and this sort of learning loss from the material they learn in school is just a necessary byproduct of that. But what is true is that there will be much more stress and there are transition costs in the affirmative system. And if we look at all of the factors cumulatively, there is still a net decline, or at best, keeping it around the same for the overall rate and quality of learning. Now, again, they talk about how in the status quo, minorities are disadvantaged and teachers are burnt out. But I believe that they are making this issue worse because, again, teachers have expressed that they need the summer break. And of course, all of these impacts that disproportionately affect minorities, like if it's more difficult to get an education, they are actively making it worse. So we'd like to turn that. Now, on the second advantage of higher education, they talk about when students enter college, they are unprepared for the coursework, and this causes a variety of problems, and it costs a lot of money that we shouldn't be spending. Well, first of all, this is really just a link from their uniqueness in the last contention, talking about the loss of learning. So I'm going to treat the first two contentions more as one argument, but we can see that because we've proven that we're at least the same, if not better, on learning, also with the added benefits of being able to do internships, summer camps, etc., and being able to schedule a trip, that all of their impacts that they've mentioned about college being more difficult, they are doing absolutely nothing to solve this. And if they were doing otherwise, if they were actually making a positive difference, then the data from MIT and its compiling of all of the existing studies would have showed a different conclusion. Now, finally, on their last point of social impacts, they talk about a lack of child summer care caused by, causing parents to potentially change jobs and things like that. But the thing is, the reason why these schools are able to provide childcare, it's because of their budgets in the first place. And if students are the wealthier students that are proportionately putting in more to these public school budgets, if they're switching over to private schools, that means that schools will be less able, public schools, to provide childcare. So whichever way you look at it, judges, I urge a strongest possible ballot for the negation team. Thank you.
All right. So I'm the second speaker, Anthony Rumbos, on the affirmation. Our judge and opponents ready. All right. With that, Mo and I are still proud to affirm resolved U.S. states should implement year-round schooling for K through 12 education. Brief on-time roadmap. I'll first be going over the issue of what type of resolution this is, then going on to our opponent's case, and then going on to ours. So our opponents kind of conceded that this is basically a fact resolution because there are like multiple actors implied in the resolution, and because any plan within this resolution would probably amount to just, we will implement the resolution. We find it fitting to just see this debate as a fact resolution. They conceded that this affects nothing, so we will continue as a fact resolution. With that, let's move on to our opponent's case, starting with their first contention about educational opportunities. The ironic thing about this contention is that literally every single opportunity that they mentioned in here are pretty much exclusively available to like wealthier students, not low-income students, like typically minority students. They bring up internships, they bring up summer camps, they bring up traveling. All of these things cost a lot of money, and they're like services that are not available to lower income students. The majority of services that help lower income students, learn, get to college, expand their knowledge, are run through public schools. That is like, for in low income communities, like public schools are like a lifeblood service that can offer many of these same opportunities that wealthier students are able to pay for. That is what we achieve when we limit the length of summer. We are actually making like society more equitable by extending these opportunities through public school systems to low income communities. But now on to more specifically like the impacts on wealthier communities. The second problem with this contention is that it assumes that there won't be any adjustment in a world in which we switch to year-round schooling. Now, I know this can be hard to imagine in a world in which like many of the opportunities that they bring up, yes, are offered during the summer, internships, traveling, etc., like summer camps. These are opportunities that don't exist because of summer. They exist because we as humans like to do things outside of school. It's a natural drive to want to pursue things in summer camps, to want to pursue internships. Obviously, there will be some sort of adjustment. Of course, I can't give any specific vision as to what this will look like in a world in which we have switched to year-round schooling, but obviously there will be some sort of adjustment. So in summary, this point, which is honestly their main point, falls A, because it only is applicable to a small segment of students, wealthier students, and secondly, because there will be some sort of adjustment. Moving on to their second contention, the idea of cost. They have a very tenuous link here as to how year-round schooling is a detriment to students' quality of education. Their entire link is that somehow, repeatedly pausing and stopping schools harm students' education. They provide very little logical rationale, however, as to why that is the case. Instead, they depend entirely on this vague meta-analysis from MIT that they give absolutely no specifics for. They say 50,000 students where? All in year-round schooling? That seems like a large number considering that we don't have year-round schooling implemented across the board in the United States. I'm sorry, I have a lot to get through. Ultimately, they give very little specifics, and because of this, we can't really trust this entire contention. You go with our logic and our links over this single meta-analysis. So what are our links? Well, once again, summer learning loss. This is a proven fact that students lose things that they have learned in the past when they aren't learning for 30 months straight. And it's harder to pick those things back up again in the initial months. Then they end up losing time in those initial months as they end up having to review instead of being able to go into new content. Schools are forced to either rush content or ignore it entirely because of the time that is spent having to review. And lastly, the idea of parents losing income due to having to forego childcare. Once again, since our opponents did attack this point, I'll go on to defend it more when I go over my own case. But we did bring up this link here, whereas parents lose income because they are forced to forego jobs, to lose their jobs during the summer break. That does detriment students' learning because growing up in a lower income household is inherently worse for learning outcomes. With that, let's move on to their third point, the idea of school segregation. They make this, once again, really tenuous link that wealthier students will end up leaving and going into private schools if we implement this change. And yeah, that might happen on certain cases, but the overall benefit of lifting lower income students by A, reducing summer learning loss, and B, expanding opportunities for them provided by summer school, services such as food and health services, as well as opportunities that supplement things like internships that are available to wealthy students, that far outweighs the small minority of wealthier families who will transition to private schools only because of this single policy change. With that, let's move on to our own case, starting out with our first contention. Once again, summer learning loss. They say that we overstate the impact of this, but really we don't. It's a pretty massive impact if every 3 months students are resetting on a significant part of what they are learning in school. This is a significant problem that faces all schools that they have to continue to correct for. Students need to be learning consistently if they want to develop. That's another point that they completely neglect, that developing, especially for younger students, it's important that they are in school and are continuously learning. Don't let them understate the impact of summer learning loss. And thus, don't let them understate the impacts that we bring up in extension to that. Impacts related to lower income communities, teacher burnout, which they, say that teachers need a summer break. Once again, we are still providing for teachers and students with several smaller breaks throughout the year. Burnout really isn't a problem as compared to the burnout that is faced at the beginning of a year when they have to scramble to review and such. Ultimately, summer learning loss is a massive problem. Do not let them understate it. Moving on to second mention, the idea of higher education. They see that we don't link this out at all. We do. When schools aren't able to cover as much curriculum because they have to spend time reviewing, and when students lose time learning during the summer, they are less prepared for college. There's a direct link between this and students having to take remedial courses in college. We link this out pretty well. Year-round schooling does help prepare students better for higher education. Now, moving on to the third and final contention, that being of social impacts. First thing to note, They completely drop our subpoint B, flow this across, don't let them respond to this in future speeches. Ultimately, schools are provisioners of social services, and they are important ones, especially in lower income communities. Ultimately, when schools are open year-round, they have more funding inherently from states that will be providing these services to open up these services year-round, which is of net benefit for students. Now moving on to our subpoint A, the idea of childcare. They completely neglect the core reasoning behind this contention. They say that schools don't provide childcare because of budgets. We're not talking about schools providing childcare. We're talking about how parents are more able to provide childcare in short breaks. However, when parents have to figure out childcare for an entire 3-month period, they're often in a bind where they can't pay for a nanny, can't find any friends or neighbors to take care of students for a short period, and thus are forced to forego jobs. That's exactly what the American Progress Survey determined. Summer break is directly correlated to parents going out of the job market, losing important skills and impacts, and thus plunging more and more low-income communities further into poverty. For all of these reasons, I urge an AF ballot.
Hello, Judge. My name is Owen Grandy. I'm the second speaker from the negation team in today's debate. Just to provide a brief off-time roadmap before I start my speech, I'm going to be first going over the negation case, then we're moving on to the AF case. I have an 8-minute speech, and my time is going to start right now. So, Judge, I'd like to start off by examining the neg case in today's debate with our first contention regarding opportunities. We outline how summification is vital to give students the opportunities for internships, jobs, college classes, and other beneficial experiences that massively benefit them both in college and later in life. Now, first of all, they respond that only wealthy students are getting access to internships, jobs, and these sorts of benefits. However, this is simply not true. First of all, internships generally are relatively cheap. They do not, internships generally are not particularly expensive. The only expenses related to them are related to actually driving to get to the workplace. You do not pay money to be in an internship. Additionally, jobs and college are exceptionally common to among people who are in the working class, especially jobs, which are something that many students who are in the working class rely on in order to help themselves get the money they need to pay for college and to further their education in the future. Additionally, many people in the working class rely on summer jobs and programs and doing work to help them get set up for further careers later down the line. For example, they might get interested in doing auto mechanics work. They might get interested in doing work in other establishments. These are things that they get extra time to focus on over the summer that will massively benefit them as life skills later in life. And the fact that the AF is just keeping them trapped in doing schooling all year round substantially limits their ability to do this. And then additionally, they state that if we shorten the summer, there's actually going to be more opportunities because there's going to be, because public schools will be able to offer these opportunities. However, this is simply not true, Judge, because as we have demonstrated, we're going to see a flight of the wealthier people from these schools. And I'll provide more information about this when I get to my third contention. We're going to see a flight of the wealthier people from these schools, and their budgets are going to be seriously diminished. And because of that diminishing of the budgets, any benefits related to public school provision are simply going to be erased. And we're not going to see any major net benefits on this point, Judge. So neg is still winning out on this point about who is providing the greater benefits. Additionally, for our subpoint B, we discussed how students in public schools are losing access to opportunities linked to summer programs. They respond by saying that the counterplan will, they respond by saying that once we switch to this new system, the programs are just going to be reformatted to accommodate the normal school year. However, this is not likely to happen, Judge, because a lot of these programs simply cannot be switched. For example, a college class, many college classes are things that are set up for college students to take, and high school students take them sort of off time when they have a full day available. And colleges are not going to suddenly switch their class times to accommodate the fact that high school students have changed their schedules. We're still going to end up with a lot of students being locked out from taking certain college classes because they no longer have that summer break where they have every single day free. Also, a lot of these internships, they require people to go somewhere and stay at a place for a long period of time. For example, stay in a city with a workplace where they're interning. That is something you obviously can't do when you have when you have these reformatted schedules, basically they're locking people out of a huge number of these internships and of these programs. These programs cannot be reformatted to fit the new schedule. And so again, Nick is winning on this point. Let's move on to our second contention, which is about the transition costs. They state we did not really specify why this is going to happen. So allow me to give some analysis and sort of explain why this is actually very likely to happen. Essentially, over the course of the school year, what is happening in their plan is they constantly start and stop the school year with short breaks interspersed throughout the entirety of the year. Now, what this does is it means that students, instead of staying concentrated on school for extended periods, which allows them to sort of build up knowledge, they constantly forget about school for a couple of weeks, then go back, then forget about school for a couple of weeks, then go back, then forget about school for a couple of weeks. And this seriously reduces their ability to accumulate knowledge because it means that they have a lesser ability to build up and reinforce their understanding. If you learn something and then the next week you have a test on it, and then the week after that you have another test on it, you're going to learn that thing a lot better than if you learn it and then you have 2 weeks off, and then you have a test on it, and then you have 2 weeks off, and then you have another test on it. That is a substantial hindrance to the amount of learning that you're doing. And so as a result of this, we're going to see necessarily a reduction in the amount of learning that is going to be occurring. And we found this study, again, composed of over 50,000 students surveyed in 2 locations. The first was in North Carolina, the second was in California. Some districts in Southern California switched over to the system, and some districts in North Carolina also switched over to the system. They were meticulously surveyed by a number of researchers, and the results are compiled into this format that found that introducing this system did not have a major positive impact on a given student's learning, nor did it have a major positive impact on reducing achievement gaps at all between races. And then finally, on the third point, school desegregation, they say there's very little evidence of the school segregation actually happening. However, we already see that people, parents have been willing to take their kids out of schools and move them to private schools for something as simple as the fact that there is an increase in, for example, the Black or Hispanic population of that school, which is something that doesn't actually impact the outcomes of a given student at all. And so the fact that they're willing to do this suggests that they would be more than willing to shift over changes like over changes that actually do have negative impacts, like the imposition of this year-round schooling program. And we already see that parents are already fleeing school districts and fleeing public school districts that have these programs in place. For example, there was a study that demonstrated that there was a loss in property values of tens of thousands of dollars in those neighborhoods where this year-round schooling was in place because parents would rather move out, or people who are going to move in would rather move to another neighborhood than have to actually send their kids to these year-round schooling. So this really suggests that year-round schooling is incredibly unpopular and is not something that is going to, it is something that's only going to entrench segregation, because we've seen and we've demonstrated that there's going to be flight of the richest students, the ones who can afford to move to private schools, towards those schools and away from public schools, which will be left underfunded and left with major budgetary shortfalls. We've already seen this happen again in response to other reforms, such as busing back in the 1970s, which had even less, which again had essentially no impact on the actual well-being of students, but parents nonetheless moved for racist reasons. And so if we look at the situation right here, now we have something that actually does demonstrably have a negative impact on the opportunities of students. Well, how are they going to react? Well, it's pretty obvious that they're going to react by fleeing the area, and we're already seeing evidence of it. And so let's move over to the AF plan. Let's first look at summer learning loss. Again, they talk about how important summer learning loss is. First of all, we stated that we have evidence that any negatives of summer learning, any resolutions to the summer learning loss issue caused by the imposition of the AF plan are outweighed by the negatives associated with constantly starting and stopping school. Additionally, we made this key point that students are still learning over the summer. It's just that they're learning different skills. They're learning, for example, skills related to housework, related to car mechanics, and all of these things that are essential life skills. They're learning how to drive. They're learning all of these things and they may not be able to do during this normal school year due to the stresses of school. And they completely conceded that all of these things are going to be substantially reduced in the ability for students to learn them as a result of the passage of the AF plan. That's a massive net negative. Also, they talk about burnout with teachers. However, we've stated that teachers are actually in favor of maintaining the current schedule system. So they are simply harming burnout. And then finally, we talk about childcare, where they say it's actually harder for there to be more childcare under their plan. Under our world, because it's harder to get people in childcare over the summer. However, splitting the year up into a ton of time breaks means that they have to make a ton of independent decisions about how they're going to do childcare, which is much harder than making one decision over the summer. For all these reasons, you must vote affirmative. You must vote negation in today's debate.
Just as an off-time roadmap to summarize my final speech is the negation, I'll generally be highlighting what I believe are the two main voter issues, what should influence the judge's decisions in today's debate, and explain why we're winning on each of those. So with all of that said, and also, of course, just doing an analysis of both worlds, but with all that said, is everyone ready? My internet's okay? Okay. My time in that case will, as always, begin on my first word. Judges, in today's debate, both teams have clashed on two main voter issues: the quality of education in either system and the external, not necessarily school-related opportunities that are present in each system. So let's run through both of those. On this first point about the quality of education, we have shown conclusively, both through the data suggesting this and our rationale for why this is the case, that in the status quo, the current system shows a better buildup of learning, less stress, and overall nullifies the impact of learning loss. Again, on this point of learning loss, which I'm sure my opponents will address in their final speech, learning loss, while it is certainly an issue, is overstated. If we look at it on the net and we factor in learning loss as well as the other learning factors, the overall rate, the overall quality of learning is the same in the worst case scenario and better in the best case scenario for our point. But if we factor in other things such as stress, well, we're clearly winning on this because it's certainly much more stressful to just have shorter breaks throughout the school year where deadlines are always looming than it is to have an extended period where, as I've stated earlier, you gradually transition away from school and then eventually gradually transition back. So on the quality of education, we believe that you should flow towards our side. But let's look at this point of opportunity. Their primary response to all of the opportunities we mentioned, getting a job, internship, vacation, college, etc., one of their main responses to this was that they essentially disregard it because they disproportionately are used by and utilized by the rich. Now, let's look at this. So first of all, as my partner stated, most internships and also job opportunities are not necessarily utilized more by the rich to begin with. There's something that can be utilized by a lot of people, and especially for working class people, having the ability to make money and potentially keep your head above poverty, that's a very important thing. And if we just have sporadic breaks throughout the year, it is much more difficult to get a job. It is incredibly difficult to do schooling effectively and do a job effectively at the same time. For these working class people, we are solving much better for them. But let's look at the other things, such as taking a college class over the summer or going on a vacation. Now, they basically talk about how this doesn't matter because it disproportionately is utilized by the rich. This, in my opinion, is ridiculous because, yes, while it is disproportionately utilized by the rich, that does not mean that vacations are bad or taking a college class is bad because more rich people take the opportunity to take a college class over the summer. Of course, it is something that we want all people to have the opportunity to do. But just because, is it a bad thing that a student learns more about something that they're passionate about because they have the chance to do so over the summer? We believe that it is not, in fact, the case. So we believe that we are better on this second and key voter issue of opportunities. But again, they've also essentially disregarded this idea, and although it was a minor point, that this is really the only time they can properly schedule a vacation. It is really difficult to plan out a vacation just within these 1 or 2 week breaks throughout the year. They're making it a lot harder for everyone, and that's why you should also just believe our warrant, because it's already unpopular in the status quo, that there will be an exodus of wealthier individuals moving from public schools to private schools, and that this will have reciprocal impacts on all of the things that they criticize. I'm sure they'll bring up the idea of childcare over the summer and why this is very important. But as we've seen here, they're trying to cast our sources as speculation, but this is just not the case. It's not speculation because we know what happens in year-round schooling. We already know that the segregation occurs where people have an exodus to private schools. This is something that we've demonstrated already. So we know for a fact that they are going to cause all of the impacts we've laid out. So overall, whichever way you look at it, I urge the strongest possible ballot for the negation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So for a brief off-time roadmap, judges, first I'll be going over some key points of clash and then moving on to voter issues, specific reasons why the affirmative wins the round. Is anyone not ready? Awesome. Start the time on my first word. Anthony and I are still proud to affirm the resolution. But first, let's look at some key points of clash that continuously plague the round. First, they bring up this idea of internships being too expensive as responses and as internships not being expensive and that they're accessible as responses in a way of providing and defending their case. First of all, saying that internships aren't expensive and that they're accessible to everyone comes from a point of privilege. These, for low-income communities and for other places, having internships and getting these opportunities like free summer programs are very, very difficult for specific communities and local, in what we've seen from the report, certain minorities. And to say that being able to access them is going to provide a fair and equal ground is, first of all, an assertion that is not backed up by evidence at all, and is also an assertion that comes from privilege. Students will not have the same grounding and will not have the same foot. Instead, let's use our public system to make sure that all students are represented equal. And by doing so, we can do that through the educational system. They also bring up this very small problem of how rich people might turn into private school instead of keeping their students in public school. Anthony hammered down on this point, talking about how, first of all, it's not that big when it's talking about the scope of the resolution, but also, even if they do, it won't even be that many people. Then the negation comes up here and says, oh, even if the rich people do send their children to private school, that they're going to lose money out of their budget and stuff. Their money and the way that they're spending it for private school is as a result of their own financial options. Them having a smaller budget isn't relevant in the round, and that's their own personal choice. And so what we can see is that the negation doesn't have any offense. They're just defending the status quo and not telling you why we should not go with the benefits that we provide as the affirmative. So now let's move on to some voter issues and break down why the affirmative wins. First of all, the biggest part and component of today's round is going to be the quality of education. Judges, the primary basis and the premise of schools is to provide education. So let's look at the quality of education. In our first contention, we talk about how summer school leads to learning loss. We bring you the Brookings Institute and also the report to the NWEA, which talk about how students on average lose 25 to 30% of their school learning over the summer, with specific minorities also losing more, and how also in the other report that students lose an average of 2 to 3 months of reading skills because of the prolonged period of summer. This is an important fact because it establishes the idea that the 3-month period of summer is the very reason that students are losing what they're learning. The negation comes up here in their last and second to last speech, talking about how, if we have mini breaks all over the place, they'll also forget stuff. No, the report itself literally told us because of the prolonged period, that 3-month period, that's why students are forgetting things. Students don't forget things when it comes to like a 1-week spring break. They forget things when it comes to a 3-month summer break. And that is the distinction we're making. Not only are we providing for more students, specifically Black and Latino students, as reported by the Brookings Institute, but we're also making sure that they're not forgetting that 25 to 30%. We can also see this ties into higher education. We told you that we want students to be better prepared, and the dropout rates was never even refuted in the round. These dropout rates are continuing to go higher, and we also see that students are becoming more and more stressed and they have anxiety because they aren't prepared for their classes. And this leads to not only more dropout rates, but also more students having a hard time going into school and continuing with it. The second reason you're voting for the affirmative today is the entire contention of social impacts. We rarely get any responses to our first subpoint of childcare and nothing from their second speaker about social services. These impacts still stand and they're huge because it tells us that 30 million kids who depend on US schools for things like free and reduced lunch go unchecked. The mental health services that provided by schools go unchecked. The more schools that are becoming vaccine centers, that was just a brief example talking about how it can be applied to today's world, was also going unchecked. We also talked about in our subcontention A about how parents are often being pushed out of the job market and how there's this disparity when it comes to income in the summer and in the regular school year. The third reason you're voting for the affirmative is because of this idea of how we're providing for net benefits. When looking at the round, you're looking at who provides the greatest amount of benefits for the greatest amount of students. And even if we're looking at the realm through the negation, we simply see no solutions. The negation provides the status quo, where students are already having a difficult time, where parents are already having trouble making sure that their students are staying at home in the summer and that they have to take off their job and do different things. We see solutions through the affirmative because first, we make sure that summer learning loss isn't a problem. That secondly, students have better access to higher education and that they aren't dropping out as much. And thirdly, the social impacts of childcare and social services do not go unchecked. And so for all of these reasons, Anthony and I are proud to affirm. Thank you.
Congrats, guys, on finishing the tournament. Good luck, obviously.
Thank you.
Okay. I voted for the op. Should I go first? Sort of explain my RFD or?
Sure. Yeah, sounds good to me.
Okay. So I made a couple of notes. So I'll just start off with reasons why reasons why I voted for the op. So the first thing is that I bought the argument that buildup of knowledge is good and that redundancy of learning loss is bad. And so the reason I came to this conclusion is that I was just looking at both honestly, there's a lot of underlying things that I'll probably get to later, but I was comparing the 25 versus 30% of knowledge is lost and the MIT study. And I found that the proposition is providing a statistic that shows that 30% of knowledge is lost in the status quo, but they don't show how, what difference, they say that this is due to the 3-month gap, but they don't show that there's a difference, or they don't show any evidence that proves some sort of solvency or comparison for year-round schooling. Whereas the MIT study at least compares different studies and says that there's a nullification or an exacerbation of learning loss when switched to year-round schooling. So because there isn't that comparison, I have to consider that the MIT evidence. Yeah, and I think that they also did they did do more work or rhetorically explaining it and kind of putting rhetoric behind the knowledge than the proposition side did. Next, the other thing I kind of wanted to the other reason I voted for the neg is that I bought the argument about how jobs are important, that even though not all these internships and research experiences or camps are accessible to low income or minority students, that summer jobs themselves are extremely important, and that while the proposition
you cut out.
argues that I think that the loss by losing these opportunities to do summer jobs or gain vocational experience is outweighed by that. And they also the negation also specifically mentions how some of these opportunities are provide paths to career, more career opportunities. When somebody's I think in the MO they talked about being able to do an auto mechanic or something like that. So oh yeah, it's on my flow I just have summer jobs provide other paths such as mechanics and things like that. And then yeah, I definitely don't agree. I buy the proposition's argument that internships are not easily accessible, and that thing and there is a really high and cost associated with those as well as accessibility. And even if they didn't directly say this, with the knowledge required or the level of understanding of certain subjects to get those internships. But I do think that losing the opportunity to have summer jobs and gain vocational experience, especially for people who don't have access to higher education, is far outweighs losing making a more equitable space by just getting rid of the few internships. So I kind of bought that. And then also now moving on to sort of reasons why the prop made it easier for me to vote for the negative. So the first thing is that I see that there's a lack of solvency arguments on the proposition side. I see that there's they talk about how there's a lot of problems with the status quo, and that and that like that some are like having a larger gap is bad, but I don't see how there's like I don't see a lot of specific links and solvency arguments as to why year-round schooling is especially good. And that was really confusing for me because of like sort of the weird formatting of the case, because at first it was like designated as a fact round without like a specific weighing mechanism, and then that line of argumentation was broken and net benefits was brought up in like the last speech, and a lot of the case was argued as a policy like round, but then there wasn't really major impacting until the last speech. And like in terms of the backwards formatting of case, the like what I'm talking about is how in your points, the way like if you're really talking about net benefits, you would rather than talking about the harms of the status quo, like if you're just looking through your impact, you're talking about how like children are like because of year-round schooling or because of not having year-round schooling, children are left behind every year and low-income students are disadvantaged, are placed at a disadvantage, and time is lost as teachers review. But in reality, you would talk about the like you want to have substantial impacts and explaining the logic behind should be like the benefits of having year-round school. So like less children are left behind, or like minority students have a more equitable education. So that way, like I see an actual solvency to your plan. And like you might be thinking like, oh, isn't it just reversible? Like, can't you just reverse those like those statements to get solvency? But I think it doesn't really work like that. You need to have specific arguments as to why year-round schooling solves for all the issues that the status quo has, not just saying that continuing with the status quo leads to more harms as the impacts for your point. You can ask me, like, you can stop me anytime if you have questions about what I'm saying, but the like usually on the affirmation case, and I think in this situation it would have benefited you to do it like that, would be to have specific, like more specific solvency arguments as to why year-round schooling is better. So moving on from that, I would say that like the negation made a really, really big mistake of dropping. I don't know why they did this, but and in all honesty, this debate was like the reason it took me so long to come to a decision is because it was kind of a little bit muddled. I don't understand why the negation side dropped the whole subpoint of social impacts, and then after it was dropped, the MG just said extend this through, and didn't even talk, like didn't just said extend our thing of our argument of social impacts through, but did not clarify what specific social impacts, or did not clarify like what the like any of the statistics on the evidence, like of the 30 million kids who are in who need like reduced lunches and all the different social impacts in that sense. That didn't make any sense to me. So then when the PMR finally brought that evidence back up, which is like one of the only pieces of impacts or like evidence-based impacts in the round, I had to take, like, I couldn't really consider those with like full force. Like I had to take them kind of under like consideration to decide, like, am I going to give them these impacts, or am I going to give them all these impacts? So yeah, that's like, that kind of disappointed me because there wasn't a lot of like impacting throughout the proposition case, versus like in the negations case, there wasn't that much impacting as well, but there was slightly more impacting in terms of like how they talked about how there's like an increase in poverty throughout. Like they talked about this multiple times in the speech, and they mentioned the LOR too, but they also talked about different things like a more diverse array of impacts, such as like how even though like how when rich people transition from public schools, it creates a drop in property values for people, like for people in the area. And that means that like not only do people in poverty have to, or like people of low income status have to continue going to public schools, but the public schools they now go to have lower funding, which means like the access to education is like the quality of education is decreased again. So I would say that like about that point, like that there's a decrease in property values and that public schools lose funding. But yeah, my issue with this whole debate is that there wasn't enough weighing of impacts, and like you can extend an impact, but that's the bare minimum. Like explaining an impact and discussing why that impact is important to, like, in the context of how it affects people's lives is really important, because and like comparing it to your opponent's points is really important, because as a judge, I don't want to intervene. I don't have to decide for myself like what's more important, right? Is like a few rich kids like getting like better access to higher education because they can attain it, and then going on to benefit the GDP is important? Or is it more important for people in low income situations or like minority people to gain access to vocational education so that they can get jobs straight out of high school? Like, which one is more important, and which one has a better economic impact? Which one has a better quality of life impact? None of that analysis was really made. And I feel like there were a lot of opportunities to do it, but they didn't really happen. If anything, I voted opposition on having slightly a little bit more information, or a little bit more of an inclination of understanding why there are like more people of low income status or like minority status are more affected by switching to a year-round schooling system than they are when it's like a big summer break. Sorry if that I rambled, but you can ask me questions or anything like that.
That was really thorough and helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Judge.
Yeah, I'm gonna get started if you guys are okay with that. This is not gonna be as long. It's a little long because that's how my RFDs are, but I did write it all out, so it shouldn't be as long. Anyway, starting from the top on like the quality of education point, which is kind of what both teams talked a lot about in their RFDs. So I think this is mainly non-unique. I think that like whether short breaks or long breaks do more harm isn't really solved throughout the round. I think that like we have competing evidence on both sides. So I don't really think that length is a problem here. So what does this affect, right? So then we go on to all the other impacts. Do we have like first the higher education one? So there isn't like much of a response. What we sort of get is like, I guess I can make the link in my head that like you being able to further, like you as like a higher income kid could take college classes over the summer, and so this is what you get out of side up. But I'm not making that link for them. What I actually do get on the flow is from Gov. You get this whole issue of like more kids are dropping out and more kids are not actually getting access to, are not actually like getting access to like these higher education classes because they have to go in and they have to like start all of these other classes over again. This wastes a lot of money, things like that. So what I would have wanted to hear from Op here, right, is that like people aren't behind when they get to college because of these breaks in school. They're behind because the schools that they go to are like traditionally less. They give like you need to be taking basically like advanced placement classes, which are like disproportionately available to like kids in higher income neighborhoods. So like it's usually just like, I hate to say it, but like less privileged schooling. Like it's usually that's the reason why kids aren't prepared to go to college. It's really not affected by like how long your break is. And insofar as like we've talked about like the length of the break doesn't actually matter. I think this would have been really important to bring up in the round, but it wasn't really talked about. So I do err on side Gov here just because like there wasn't a great response to this. So then on the opportunity point, right, with like internships and vacations and stuff like that, I think that like the response that these are privileged things, I think this like does most of the work here. I think that like the alternative here being that like you have like I can't read my own handwriting and it's been a minute since I wrote this. I don't remember what that says. Either way, I think what I needed to hear from Op here is like the services are year round generally. I think that because you sort of let the debate play out, as in like these lower income students don't have access to any services on these breaks, and like the only service I guess that they need are that like their parents are going to be able to take care of them. This isn't really true, and like you let Gov basically like have a cakewalk and say that like the like free meals and vaccination centers and like and all of these like schooling benefits only come during the school year. That's not true, actually. Like, public schools provide all of these things year round. Free meals are a government mandated service that are provided year round. A lot of summer camps are public so that kids can participate in these things. And there are a lot of internship programs that are started in these like lower income areas that get these kids internships that pay them money so that they can actually like do something with their summer and still be providing for their family. Also, like, the fact that you guys talked about like jobs maybe helping lower income people, but didn't actually make the link that like they could use to provide for their family. You guys used the job point as like, oh, well, like kids can get this to like further their education in the future. Like, that's fine, but you really need to extend that for me about like how they need to use it to provide for their family, and how this could like mitigate the impact of like parents needing to like switch jobs and shit and stuff like that. I'm so sorry. Anyway, so now going on to the next point. Really what I got here is that like oh, sorry. Also from Gov here, I could have on the vacation point, right? I could have also gotten that like 1 week is more than enough time for vacations. People go on vacations for like 3 days at this point. But also like outweighing with sort of like this childcare and like privilege point is also okay. Like I think that does most of the work. So now going on to like the two most unique points in the round, I think. First is childcare, and second is like segregation and like the budget. The first one's out of Gov, the second one's out of Op. So on childcare from Gov, I think this is mostly where I vote. I think that like even without like without like public programs, like it probably is true that like it's easier to find childcare during shorter amounts of time. I think they do enough work on this and pull this through enough that I can believe this. Given that there's no real alternative from Op except that like privileged kids will leave the system, I don't really see how this actually like helps the lower income parents. Like I can see maybe this helps lower income children, but not the parents. Which are uniquely affected in this round and carried throughout the round, but not really responded to. Like, you talk a lot about the students, but really nothing about the parents on Op, which is a little bit frustrating. And then sort of like on this point about like privileged kids leaving systems, sort of like the segregation impact and like and people like losing out on their budget. So we get that like these kids will flee the school system, and the response is that like the budget doesn't matter. I don't think that's the right response. I think that the right response from Gov that I really needed was like these kids have to pay taxes, right? Like schools are funded by taxes, and these rich kids going to these private schools still have to pay taxes. So like that still helps out in these areas. I think like, you know, maybe because they literally said like kids were moving away, then this affects it less. But I think like generally taxes still exist and like will be dispersed enough throughout states that like probably could have used that. But anyway, like I think that like budget doesn't matter isn't super responsive, but like insofar as like we do still get you guys outweighing this with this childcare social services impact, which the other judge also pointed out wasn't super well responded to. Insofar as that was true, I ended up buying this point. The other thing that I sort of want to see here, and I'm giving all this advice because I hope this will be helpful if we do have to redo this round. I'm being told mixed things. I don't have to redo it, but either way, Gov could have turned this argument by saying that like kids who want opportunities can still get them, and like who still want to be doing internships can literally still get them if these kids flee to other districts. Why, right? This is because like kids from public schools will still be able to get like free summer school. They'll also be able to the richer kids will be able to like go on vacations, do whatever. Sorry, that did not make sense. The lower income kids will be able to like will be able to be taken care of by their parents because they're not away for as long, and then the richer kids will be able to still like do these internships and stuff like that because they'll be going to other schools that will allow them to do those things. So if that is really that important, then that benefit still exists, and Gov could have sort of co-opted this and made this a really strong point for their side. I think that like in addition to like the opportunities that people get, I think that like that this point does undermine points about like maybe like the equality of education. Like I still think that like segregation is probably a really strong impact that the op had, but I think that outweighing it with the childcare point was fairly strong. I think that like insofar as there's literally no way to solve this, like I think that at least with segregation, like funding still exists isn't the greatest way to win that, but like it did enough work, and this childcare and like social services point does enough work for me, and there's really no response on like what the lower income parents are going to do, that I end up voting Gov here very, very marginally. And so for those reasons, you know, it was a split decision. It was a pretty good round. So I hope that helped. I hope that was helpful. If we do have to debate this again, I hope you guys will like take that advice and make that work for next time. But obviously, congrats on getting to TOC. Maybe this is the end of the tournament. If it is, congrats on that too. And have a good night.
All right. Thank you so much,